Welcome back, everyone, to another exciting edition of the Lone Star Chronicles. I'm Brian Naples, as always, and I'm so excited to bring you a recent presentation that Bill O'Neill gave on the life and times of Sam Houston. And boy, what a presentation it was. Bill begins by discussing Sam Houston as a larger-than-life figure. He then goes through his childhood and his early connections with the military, his moval from Virginia, where he's born, out west into Tennessee, eventually to Oklahoma, and then into Texas. And Bill discusses all of the fascinating exploits that Sam Houston goes through in his life. Especially, he spends a good amount of time in 1836 and the war for Texas independence. But of course, his connection with all of the American presidents and his political associations. Sam Houston personally knew 14 American presidents. Ultimately, Texas will join the Union, and Sam Houston will become the governor of Texas. And he is not forced to leave office until 1861, when Texas joins the Confederacy. So I hope you all enjoy. And as always, please press the like and subscribe button so I can continue to bring you more of these exciting episodes. Let's listen in with Bill.
Mr. Bill O'Neill was the former Texas state historian and past president and fellow of the East Texas Historical Association. He was a recipient of the association's Ralph W. Steen and Best of East Texas awards and a member of the Western Writers of America. He taught history here more than 30 years ago at Panola College. I was actually one of his students in the 1900s. And he received a Piper Professorship Teaching Award in 2000. He is a frequent public speaker and has also appeared on television documentaries for the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, TBS, the A&E Channel, and TNN. I'm thrilled that he is here to tell us the riveting story of Sam Houston.
Thank you very much, Penny. The Panola College Library lunchbox special were indeed brought to perfection by Christy Ferguson, who's from Memphis. But following her retirement a few years ago, this praiseworthy college/community event kind of slipped between the cracks for a couple of years, and until the arrival on campus of director Penny Radley. She went to work to revive this event, and that included, on very short notice, lining up the outstanding Sam Houston display across the hall in our gallery. So, Penny, thank you very much. Shortly after I was sworn in as state historian by Governor Rick Perry at his office in the Capitol building, Joan Marshall, who was director of the superb Bob Bullock Texas History Museum in Austin, she invited me to, I don't know where she got this title, but she invited me to make a public address there on a Sunday afternoon on the leadership qualities of Sam Houston. Well, I was delighted, and I worked very hard on my presentation. It was well received, to my surprise, by a large crowd on a Sunday afternoon. I used it on other occasions and finally expanded it into a book, Sam Houston, A Study in Leadership. It was published on his birthday, March 2, 2016, and it was introduced that day right here in this room. And then we highballed up to Dallas, and the next day we took it to an event in downtown, and that inaugurated a 2-week book tour. It was on those occasions that, boy, I found out I learned that Sam Houston remains a Texas icon. Sam Houston, A Study in Leadership. Sam Houston radiated leadership, physically imposing and a man of powerful convictions. He gravitated to leadership roles throughout his adventurous life. When he was 21, he was wounded 3 times while leading charges at Horseshoe Bend. More than 2 decades later, General Houston was severely wounded while leading the spectacular victory at San Jacinto. A prolific public life placed him in the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Senate, governorship of both Tennessee and Texas, and he is the only man to this day that's ever served as governor of 2 states. And then he served as president of the Lone Star Republic twice. Now, just south of Huntsville today, and I'm sure some of you've seen it coming up from the south, there's a 67-foot statue of Sam Houston that overlooks I-45. It's made out of 60,000 pounds of concrete and mounted atop a 10-foot granite base. I've taken a lot of Panola students down there and to other sites in that area, and they always figured out a way to get 25 of them up on that 10-foot base. And it's visible as you come up from the south for more than 6 miles. Art is a reflection of life, and this tower, larger than life piece of visual art, is a representative tribute to a larger than life leader. Aside from this spectacular sculpture, which is generally called Big Sam, many other artists have fashioned their own tributes to Houston. You go in the front door of our magnificent state capitol building, and the entrance to the rotunda is flanked by superb marble statues of Stephen F. Austin on the right and Sam Houston on the left. These were commissioned back in 1893 for the Chicago World's Fair. And then after the fair and millions of people saw them, we got them back, and they've been installed at the state capitol where a great many people see them every day. Each state is permitted to have 2 statues at the National Capitol in Statuary Hall, which is the old original House of Representatives chamber where Sam Houston, as a young congressman, first was seated. In the Virginia state capitol, now he was born in Virginia. There's a bust of native son Sam Houston prominently displayed in their capitol building. A magnificent equestrian statue of Sam Houston stands prominently in Herman Park in the city of Houston. Man, he's on a horse and wearing a tricorn hat. It's a great statue. Statue of Houston stands at the west entrance of the State Archives and Library building, which is just across the East Lawn from the state capitol. Another handsome bust of Houston stands just inside the entrance of the Sam Houston Regional Archives and Library a few miles north of Liberty. A different kind of visual art is painted. And just inside our state capitol is Surrender of Santana by William Huddle. It hangs a few feet from that statue of Sam Houston that I described. It is 7 feet by 9.5 feet. And Sam is right in the center. Well, he's lying wounded under a tree. There are 35 identifiable historical characters in that thing, and Huddle did it in 1890. Then, also in 1890, Huddle produced a big portrait of Houston, and that portrait is displayed behind the Speaker's rostrum in the State House of Representatives. You walk right up to it on a given day and see it. It hangs beside the only textile in the Capitol Art Collection, the flag of the Texas Army during the Battle of San Jacinto. Now, I got to show you this. Where'd my flag go? Whoops. Here it is. Here it is. Somebody want to come hold the other end of this? Oh, come on. Somebody is coming. Hold it up. Hold your end up. I got this. I'm going to show you what it is. There was a businessman from Kentucky who was, he was mesmerized by this fight for liberty that Texas had in 1835 and 36. So he sold one of his businesses so that he could equip a company of men. And he equipped 52 men with arms and uniforms and everything. And so the housewives got together and they put this thing, and they marched off to Texas with this flag. When we got time, we didn't have a Lone Star flag yet. And when it got to be time for the battle, this is the only flag in the whole camp. And they pulled this thing out, and that is the goddess of liberty displayed there. And that was the battle flag at San Jacinto. Young man, thank you very kindly. I appreciate it. One of my favorite flags. On April 21, 1911, April 21 is the anniversary that was the 75th anniversary, as a matter of fact, of the Battle of San Jacinto. A superb equestrian relief statue of Texas gray granite was unveiled at Houston's grave in Huntsville. Houston is mounted and he's flanked by symbolic figures of liberty and history. And in large letters is a quote from Andrew Jackson: "The world will take care of Houston's fame." Now, you drive right up to that thing. I mean, right up to it. There's just a little old fence there and it's paved, and you ride right up to it. Look, you take pictures from the car and everything. The world will take care of Houston's fame. Well, brother, the world has taken care of Houston's fame. The reservoir of public memory about Sam Houston features, as we've seen, a rich collection of statues, paintings, and biographies. The first really good biography about Houston was written, I know it's hard to conceive of this, but it was actually written before I was alive. And it was a guy named Marquise James wrote a book called the Raven, and it won the Pulitzer Prize for biography that year. The nation's fourth largest city. Speaking of books, let me show you something. This book called 6'6", that was written by his wife. And she listed him as a co-author because he dug up all the research. 6'6", the heroic study of Sam Houston. And I was given this when I was in the fourth grade. I got hooked on Houston as well. And they took me to, my folks took me to Huntsville and stuff. And I got another juvenile book, and somehow or another, I kept both of them. And they're good little books. Well, I read and reread them. Did you know that the nation's fourth largest city, Houston, is named after Sam Houston, along with countless with counties in 3 states? There's a national forest near Huntsville that's named after him. There's a military base, Fort Sam Houston, in San Antonio. A nuclear submarine, the USS Sam Houston, was commissioned in 1961. There are parks. There's a wonderful memorial museum in Huntsville. You got to see it sometime. And there was a Sam Houston postage stamp, and I got a picture of it in the book that I did. A university, Sam Houston State, numerous junior highs, high schools, and grade schools. And in fact, I attended the 4th and 5th grade. I was your age at Sam Houston Elementary in Corsicana. So I was in Sam Houston School when I learned about him. Houston has been honored and commemorated and memorialized in a manner worthy of an historical icon. Well, this future icon was born on March 2, 1793, on his parents' plantation in the mountainous country of Western Virginia. He turned out to be the 5th of 9 children, which means he was a middle child. But brother, there was nothing of the tranquil temperament of a typical middle child in his type A personality. His father was Major Samuel Houston, so he was a namesake. And Major Houston was, as Lieutenant Houston, he was a junior officer, combat officer during the American Revolution, and he stuck with the military as a militia, a ranking officer in the militia. He'd go out on weekends to conduct drills in different communities. And little Sam always wanted to tag along with him, and he'd line up with the guys, and he would march, and he learned the drills as well as anybody. Well, unfortunately, Sam's daddy died when the boy was just 13. The family moved to land that big Sam had purchased in eastern Tennessee. The Houstons went ahead and they went in 3 wagons. Remember, there were a lot of kids. And off they went in 3 wagons through forest trails. It was a big adventure for little Sam. They moved to land that Sam Sr. had purchased, and the Houstons established a farm near Maryville, which is in eastern Tennessee. Like another backwoods boy, 14 years his junior, Abraham Lincoln, Sam had only a skimpy education, just what you could pick up in a short term at a log cabin school. But Sam and Abe also shared a dislike of the drudgery of farm work. And they both became avid readers, learned a lot with that. When Sam's older brothers, and apparently his mama, tried to harness him to the family farm, he was now 16. And he showed a mind of his own. He didn't want any part of that life. And he left home, 16. He crossed the Tennessee River and plunged 100 miles deep into the pure wilderness to live with Cherokees. And he didn't know any Cherokees, but he wound up there and he was fascinated by Native Americans. He embraced the Cherokee lifestyle. He was a teenager. He liked the teenage young ladies with the Cherokees. The chief adopted Sam. That meant something since he just lost his father. And he was named Colonel. And Colonel meant the raven. And Sam lived for 3 years with his so-called Indian father, whom he would link up with again later. Throughout the rest of his long life, the Raven felt deep empathy with Native Americans, and this often placed him at odds with fellow citizens because we fought Native Americans a great deal, but he didn't care. He had the courage of his convictions at a young age. Now, he finally returned home after being gone for 4 years when war again broke out with Great Britain. Our first war, American Revolution was against the British. And here we're fighting again in the War of 1812. Emulating his father, Sam joined the Army in March 1813, shortly after his 20th birthday. Private Houston exhibited enough leadership qualities to get immediately promoted to sergeant. He was a big old guy. They found out he knew everything about drill, and all of a sudden they made a drill sergeant after him. And then not long afterwards, he was promoted to lieutenant. Another Tennessean, General Andrew Jackson, he marched against an Indian Confederacy in the Southwest with an army comprised of regular soldiers and frontier riflemen. Well, Lieutenant Houston was part of Jackson's regular army contingent. That campaign climaxed in August 1814 at Horseshoe Bend, where the warriors decided to make a stand against their pursuers. It was a horseshoe-shaped bend in the river in eastern Alabama, and what today is eastern Alabama. They threw up a log barricade, and I mean, it was a doozy. You can see it today at that National Battlefield Park. And the regulars were assigned to attack that barricade. Lieutenant Houston led from the front as he would all his life. He charged ahead of his men. The first man to clamber over that barricade was Major Lemuel Montgomery, and he was immediately killed. Lieutenant Houston was right behind him, and he had a saber in his hand, but all of a sudden he caught an arrow in his upper thigh, and what he did, use that big old saber, and remember, he's a big guy, and he fought off the warriors until his men caught up with him. He insisted that the arrow be pulled out so that he could continue to fight. But the barbed arrowhead, when they pulled it out, it took a hunk of tissue with it. He was bleeding badly. They patched him up a little bit, laid him out, and he was stretched out on the ground while the barricade defense was broken. When General Jackson rode by, he saw him stretched out and bleeding and so forth, and he ordered the wounded officer to stay out of the fighting. But later in the day, there were no volunteers when Jackson called for a charge against a redoubt. Now, I would compare it. There was heavy logs. It's sort of like a blockhouse. And it was a real strong point. Nobody wanted to attack that thing. So Lieutenant Houston, he thought, they'll follow me. And he he limped forward, barred somebody's musket, and he headed for that redoubt all by himself. And nobody followed him. They didn't want any part of that. He got 5 yards away from the blockhouse, and he stopped and leveled his musket. And before he could trigger it, bam, a volley from the loopholes wounded him twice more. He was hit in the right arm and in the right shoulder. And the shoulder is a very complex joint. And he would have that thing, he had to have multiple operations. There was no ether, wasn't invented for several more years, 1846, I think. And he had to have these surgeries without any kind. He figured out an anesthetic of his own, and he kept it in his pocket. And he would do that, and he needed that anesthetic all his life. As it turned out, in fact, that thing had to be bandaged. It seeped, and it had to be bandaged every night the rest of his life. He lived 60 more years. He had played a courageous role in shattering the Confederacy, but he was lucky he wasn't killed. So now he faced a long convalescence with all those operations, and he stayed in the Army until 1818. That was the 5th anniversary of his enlistment. He decided not to enlist again. He read law in Nashville, was admitted to the bar. He also became a Freemason, rising rapidly in that prominent order. Sponsored by Andrew Jackson, Houston was appointed by the governor as Tennessee's adjutant general, and that had a military rank of colonel of the state militia. But he got the state militia, and here were all these junior officers that were in the state militia, and all they'd heard was all these stories of heroism about him and so forth. And he commanded immediate respect, and so he was elected Major General of the state militia by his fellow officers. Major General is a two-star general. Prominent and respected Major General Houston was still in his 20s, and he's a Major General. 2 years later, his rise continued with the support of Andrew Jackson's political machine. He was elected to Congress in 1823, and he won re-election 2 years later. And then the next year, 1826, Congressman Houston got crossways politically with another guy, fellow named White, and they couldn't sell it, and they decided to duel. Now, those pistol duels or sword duels too, this was pistol duel. Those were illegal by this time, but they didn't pay any attention to that. They had their duel, and Houston gunned him down. He shot him. Guy nearly died, but he did. He did survive, and in many quarters, even though it's not illegal, in many quarters, this affair only added to the growing respect for Houston. Indeed, the next year, 1827, Houston was elected governor of Tennessee. Now, at every step of his rapid ascent to high office, Houston assumed the mantle of leadership readily and confidently. He was tall and handsome and self-assured, and he moved easily in high circles. And I started thinking about this. He visited his first president on his way to Washington for the first time, and he stopped at Monticello, climbed the mountain, and visited the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. And I started looking up how many of these presidents he had been around. Well, he worked with all these guys, and some of them were still in Congress and become president later. But beginning with that visit to Monticello early in his career, he was acquainted with, or he had contact with, or worked beside 14 U.S. presidents, the nation's most successful leaders. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, President and General. Martin Van Buren, President and General. William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, James K. Polk, President and General. Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, Abraham Lincoln. They were in Congress together. In addition, Senator Houston worked alongside another senator, later Confederate President Jefferson Davis. So there's yet another president. He also worked with other prominent national leaders who didn't become president: Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, everybody's heard of him, and Daniel Webster. Houston said, he wrote, there was a grandeur about legislation then that was impressive awe. I'm not sure how much grandeur there is in the halls of Congress today. You can learn an awful lot about leadership styles and techniques, and even about what not to do by rubbing shoulders with men of such caliber: presidents, generals, senators, cabinet members, speakers of the House, and orators. Now, after Houston's patron and mentor, Andrew Jackson, won the presidency in 1828, there began to be speculation that Governor Houston, governor of his home state, Tennessee, might succeed him when he left the White House. So here's Houston becoming president. That's what everybody's starting to think. But in 1829, Governor Houston married 19-year-old Eliza Allen. Well, she was 19. She had a sweetheart. She also had a very ambitious family. They lived on a plantation, and they were thinking, oh, brother, she's going to be, if they get married, she's first lady of Tennessee at 19. And then in a few years, she's going to be first lady of the land. And so they pushed her into that marriage, and it turned out to be a disaster. Houston, the way it went, Houston, actually, she left home, went back to the plantation. Houston, there was such a public furor that Houston felt honor bound to resign the governorship, which ended any prospects of succeeding Jackson as president. Now, that seems tragic. But if Governor Houston had stayed on track for the U.S. presidency, he would not have turned up in Texas during the 1830s. And I'm convinced that there's not another man in Texas in that period that had the stature, the reputation, military background, the leadership qualities to lead a successful revolution against Mexico. He's the only guy who could have pulled it off, just as George Washington, I guarantee you, was the only guy who could have pulled off what he did during the American Revolution. Anyway, his political future looks like now is in ruins. Boy, he's out of the governor's office, forget the presidency. So the Raven went to Indian Territory, which is now called Oklahoma, to live again among the Cherokees. He went back to his Indian father, and he's going to lick his wound. He got married again. She was a fine woman. She was a half-blood. She was half Cherokee and half white. And they started a trading post near Fort Gibson, and that fort is still there. That's a great place to visit. And she's buried in the nearby National Cemetery. They don't have one national cemetery in Oklahoma, and she's in the honor circle. She ran the trading post. He didn't want to do anything like that. But the Indians started calling on him. They found out what a honcho he had been in Washington. So they started getting him to take delegations to Washington, D.C. and try to get a better deal for the Indians. But something else is going on. Remember how they used to call him the Raven? Well, now they changed his nickname to Big Drunk. And he starts gravitating back to where he had been before. Now, while he was in the East on one of these visits in 1832, he had an encounter with Ohio Congressman William Stanberry in Washington, D.C. Stanberry had badmouthed Houston, an old political enemy. And so Houston gave him a challenge to duel. He nearly killed the guy in his last duel. And Stanberry didn't want any part of it. He started carrying pistols, 2 small pocket pistols, in his vest. And one night, sure enough, they did encounter each other. And he sees Houston, and Houston starts coming straight for him. He pulls out one of those pistols, jammed it against Houston's torso, pulled the trigger, click. Fortunately, the powder had gotten wet, and Houston therefore just beat the tar out of it. He clobbered him, but good. And again, this incident increased respect for the forceful Houston. People in Tennessee were frontiersmen. They thought, yeah, that's good. Later that year, Houston, always a man of grand dreams, he traveled to Texas, sensing that this was his land of promise. Houston's ambitions reawakened at the possibilities he saw in frontier Texas. It was rumored that he was an agent of the United States, maybe reporting directly to President Andrew Jackson, and that may have been true. True or not, these rumors added an air of mystery and importance to Houston's presence. And upon his arrival, he had the most prominent background of any man in Texas. He was a former governor, U.S. congressman, and a military hero. And his experiences as a duelist and as a brawler only improved his image to most members of the rough and tumble Texas society. We were a rough bunch of people back in those days. Relations were touchy between the Texans and Mexico. And by the fall of 1835, Texans were in rebellion against the Mexican government under the dictatorial General Santana. Houston played an important role in these momentous events, and on March 2, 1836, he was one of 59 men who signed the Texas Declaration of Independence. And by a delicious historical coincidence, that was Sam Houston's 43rd birthday. It was his birthday when he signed our Declaration of Independence. And then the Congress appointed him Major General in command of all Texas forces. So it's the second time he's been commissioned a 2-star general. Now, a word about the warriors of that day. His passport said he was 6'2" and 240 pounds. Most people didn't think he was that small. Most people thought he was, they agreed with the 240 pounds, but they thought he was maybe 6'3", 6'4". A lot of people called him 6'6". You saw the title of that book. But whatever he was a giant among men born 2 centuries ago because people were smaller then. Sheer physical size is a great asset for combat leaders. The greatest military leader of the early Middle Ages was Charlemagne, great warrior king, and everybody said he was 7 feet tall. Okay, they finally got into his tomb centuries later, and his frame was such that he would have been 6'6". Well, the average knight in the early Middle Ages was 5'4". So there were some guys that were big guys, 5'6", 5'7", but there were plenty of these 5'4" guys that were 5'3" to 5'2", and to them, Charlemagne looked like he was 7 feet tall. Houston looked like he was 6'6". And George Washington, and from 1700s, he was 6'3", and he was physically impressive at 6'3", and he had remarkable muscular strength, and he liked to show it off. He'd get a walnut and just crack it between his fingers. Houston was a big man. He rode a big horse, and he named Saracen. Of course, he had a towering reputation. Governor of Tennessee, hero of Horseshoe Bend, Major General of Tennessee Militia, veteran of personal altercations, and now he had a Major General's commission from the Texas government. These qualities triggered immediate respect among the citizen soldiers who served under him. Houston's imposing physique and his equally imposing background lent him instant credibility among volunteers. Few of the 1,400 and more men who served under Houston that spring during that 6-week campaign, few of them had ever even been in an army. The 900 men approximately who fought under him at San Jacinto, 42 of them, I think, had been in the U.S. Army for a little while. That's it. They were Texas farmers who volunteered to defend their homes and families, or they were adventurers from the U.S. there to acquire land. But they all were risking their lives. And while most were competent riflemen, it was a hunting society. They were disorganized and they knew nothing of military maneuvers. San Houston, when I say military maneuvers too, let me tell you, Houston did a little training as they were on the march when they'd stop for a couple of days here and there. And here was the thing. If it had been Captain Houston in charge of a 40-man company, then he could have gotten his lieutenant to take 20 of them over here and do so-and-so, while Houston, took the other 20 over here. But he's dealing with nearly 1,000 men on a battlefield. And he knew what that meant. And he had to teach these guys some basics of moving en masse on a battlefield. He had, after all, spent half a decade as an officer in the U.S. Army, and he certainly knew how to teach close order drill and other basic maneuvers. And his experience as commander of the Tennessee State Militia had taught him how to organize large numbers of backwoods volunteers. So Major General Houston left Washington on the Brazos, and they started riding toward Gonzales, where they heard that volunteers were gathering to go to the Alamo and relieve those guys there. They just needed some leadership. And he arrived on March 11th. Now, they didn't know, no cell phones in those days. They didn't know that the Alamo had fallen 5 days earlier, March 6th. But anyway, they found 374 volunteer riflemen waiting in a camp beside the Guadalupe River. Houston immediately organized these men into companies and into a regiment. But that very day, before bedtime, news arrived of the devastating defeat at the Alamo, that everybody had been killed. And the next day, the superb scout, Deaf Smith, brought Susanna Dickinson and her daughter, and she had seen her husband, almost seen him die in front of her. And the sad thing was, the last reinforcements to the Alamo were 30-some-odd men from Gonzales, which was just a log cabin village about 60 miles away. And every log cabin had lost daddy, husband, the father. Everybody had lost somebody. And boy, there was grief-stricken wailing all that night. Houston, meantime, wrote orders to Colonel James Fannin. Remember, he just found out he lost 200 men at the Alamo. And Colonel James Fannin commanded 400 men at Goliad. And he wrote him to destroy the fortifications there and join him. But Fannin ignored him. And he didn't go. He let himself and his command get captured, and they were executed almost to a man. There were only about 40 survivors of the 400. And what that meant was that the only men left to try to fight off Santa Anna were under Houston's command. Fully expecting an advance by Santa Anna and his victorious army of thousands, General Houston conceived a strategy that would prove very controversial and a Herculean test of his leadership ability. He immediately led his army eastward and commenced a strategic retreat into the Anglo heart of Texas. Further east he went, the more Anglo settlers there were. And that brought him farther and farther away from the Tejano section, which was clustered around San Antonio, Goliad, and South Texas, Refugio. While Houston's men marched closer and closer to their manpower and supply base, Mexican supply lines were stretched to perilous lengths. Villages were burned. General Houston seemed to be following a scorched earth policy. Let the Mexicans eat this. And he lured the Mexican army deep into an unfriendly region where Santa Anna could not supply his men. As Santa Anna advanced, he found it necessary to divide his army first into three columns. He's got to try to find this guy. Well, he couldn't find him. So he split off another column, four. And by the time the Battle of San Jacinto was fought, there were five guys. There were five splinter groups, five columns, and one of them was led by Santa Anna. And those columns were getting smaller and smaller. And the idea was that Houston's much smaller army would have a better chance, at least against one of those Mexican columns. There's a military action. Don't split your forces in the face of the enemy. And they did. At the same time, Texan non-combatants, women and children, tagged along as close as possible to Houston's army. They hauled their possessions as best they could. A growing number of desperate refugees thus engaged in a terrible retreat known, and you guys, if you've heard of it, you'll hear of it soon. It's called the Runaway Trail. Made worse for the refugees and for both armies by incessant rains. Every creek and river was swollen while woods were muddy quagmires, and there were no bridges. There was no infrastructure at all in Texas. The men griped and complained about retreating in the face of the enemy. They didn't want to retreat. They wanted to fight them. About marching through the rain and mud on empty stomachs. And some of the officers talked openly about finding a new commander. Some of them spoke mutinous defiance, apparently within the hearing of Houston. But Houston ignored them. He appeared not to hear taunts. He remained aloof from petty critics. He did not consult his officers. In fact, he wrote to his friend and supporter, Secretary of War, Thomas J. Rush, who would fight deciding, as it turned out, at San Jacinto. He said, I consulted no one. I held no councils of war. If I err, the blame is mine. He took the blame right there. Interim President David G. Burnett, he'd just been sort of appointed, nobody elected. But he was out on the run before Santa Anna's troops, and he wrote to Houston, the enemy are laughing you to start. You must fight them. You must retreat no further. The country expects you to fight. He was scared to death. He knew Santa Anna would hang him, but Houston would not be hurried. And although some of his men continued to desert, mostly to be with their families, his army remained intact. Despite their complaints, despite the criticism of some of their officers, the men continued to follow the directions of Houston. He had impressed them from the start, and his tight-lipped assurance in himself somehow added a touch of authority. Despite weeks of retreating through mud and rain and scant provisions, the core of the army did not lose confidence in their imposing general. Like Washington and Valley Forge, Houston kept his army together. It turned out in the end that Houston had never lost his grip on the ultimate purpose of an army, which is to fight. And finally, when Santa Anna placed his column, the smallest of the columns, with inferior numbers within reach, Houston pounced. He led 1,000 men in a night march. He lost about 100 of them during the night. But when they got in position to tangle with Santa Anna, he made a speech. And remember, he's an old politician. He can make a speech, have a deep voice, and he closed his speech with these lines. Victory is certain. Trust in God and fear not. And remember the Alamo. Remember the Alamo. Thus it was, he gave them their battle cry. And the Texians confronted Santa Anna's column in a grassy marsh at Buffalo Bayou and on the San Jacinto River. If you've ever been to the San Jacinto Monument, you've been to the spot. Houston encamped his men in a line of timber several hundred yards from the Mexican camp. The Mexican camp was atop a hill, and there was some lakes behind it. Terrible place for a camp. But anyway, he had a gift from people of Cincinnati, and I think a gift from God, because the people of Cincinnati decided they probably need a couple of cannons down in Texas. And they sent two field cannon nicknamed the Twin Sisters to us. And somehow Santa Anna couldn't find it, but those two cannons found him. And the Twin Sisters were with him. And on April 20th, the Twin Sisters had a brief duel with Santa Anna's single artillery piece. He had a great big cannon. And there was a cavalry skirmish that day. During the night, Santa Anna's men threw up a barricade, saddles, supply crates, brush in front of their camp in anticipation of a dawn attack on April 21. Santa Anna just knew Houston was going to attack it. He had more men. But Houston stayed up most of that night planning an attack over unfamiliar terrain. He'd never been here before. And he slept until mid-morning. During that morning, Santana's brother-in-law, General Coase, arrived with his column of close to 500 men. Now there were perhaps 1,300 or more soldados in the Mexican camp, and we only had not quite 900 men. So Houston had lost the numerical advantage. At last, he allowed a council of war at noon on April 21. There was considerable talk among the officers about a dawn attack the next day. But the Texian soldiers were at a fighting pitch. Company after company voted to attack now. And Houston was riding his big old horse quietly around the moment. He wasn't speaking to anybody. He was just watching them. And like any good leader, he read the mood of his men, and he ordered an attack that very afternoon. He wanted his men to eat lunch, to fight on full stomachs, and to prepare their weapons. And that's what they did. Meanwhile, General Coase's men had marched all night long. Santana's men also were exhausted from their nighttime labors with the barricade. So most of their camp went into siesta, including Santana, who retired to his marquee with a girlfriend known as the Yellow Rose of Texas, because she was of the black blood. General Houston began to form his units at the mid-afternoon of April 21, middle afternoon. The small cavalry force, he had 60 mounted men. They were on the right flank to cut off an escape route to the south. The twin sisters were right in the middle of the formation. Infantry companies were in marching formation. Here they came up the hill, and the Mexicans continued to siesta. The sentries, they started to notice them a little bit because they saw Houston riding back and forth in front of his line. He didn't want them to get out of line. He wanted them to strike the Mexican camp in order. And he wanted to be able to control fire. Of course, the visible presence of their general inspired the Texians, but Houston and Saracen made a great target, and Houston began to hear thump, thump, thump. 7 musket balls hit his horse and made his bigger target than Houston, and the horse collapsed dead. Houston mounted an aide's horse and continued his dangerous patrol across the advancing front. Artillerymen muscled the twin sisters. They didn't have any animals to pull those things, and they muscled the twin sisters uphill across wet ground until they got close enough to the Mexican barricade, and they fired those things, and they blew that barricade to smithereens. The Mexican cannon was loaded with grape shot, but it was firing downhill, and it fired high. Didn't hit anybody. Texian riflemen began to shoot back at the sentries who were shooting at him. Houston shouted for a volley at close range, but again he went down with his horse. He quickly remounted as his right boot began to fill with blood from an ankle wound. A copper ball had shattered his ankle. Mexican officers began forming up their men when the Texians finally fired that volley that Houston wanted. They shot for the brave. We had learned to shoot for the brave fighting against the British in 2 wars. The guys with the fancy uniforms were the leaders, and we tried to knock them down, and that's what we did with these guys. Brigadier General Castrillon was killed. 9 colonels were killed or wounded. 5 lieutenant colonels, 2 majors, 12 captains, 13 lieutenants. And Santa Anna came out of his tent. He saw all those officers going down. He wouldn't even put his general's uniform back on. He got a horse and he galloped away. There was then a wild charge as the Texans wanted revenge. Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad. Resistance ended within 18 minutes. Did you know we won the Battle of San Jacinto in 18 minutes? With fighting then slaughter ensued. Houston and his officers simply lost control of their men. A soldado would be saying, "Mino Alamo, Mino Goliad," walk. A rifle butt would brain them, or somebody would cut their throat with a Bowie knife. In all, when it finally turned dark and all that stuff, 630 Mexicans had been killed. 9 Texans, 630 Mexicans, 9 Texans. 208 soldados were wounded, and 34 of our guys were wounded, including Houston. A total count of wounded, 700 were captured. The Mexican army of Santa Anna disappeared. All the next day, while Houston lay on a pallet having his painful wound tended. Prisoners were brought in. Late in the day of the Drago captive was brought in, and the soldado stood up and said, El Presidente, El Presidente. And he's going, shh. And the Texans clamored to lynch Santana. But Houston saw a much larger picture. He ordered Santana detained and guarded, and to save his life, the self-styled Napoleon of the West ordered all of his troops back to Mexico, signed a disastrous treaty recognizing the Republic of Texas as a nation and the Rio Grande as the southern boundary. The boundary had always been up here. Santana did that. The Band of Wood in Houston was taken to New Orleans for better care. I'll tell you, they somehow had 5,000 people there. It's a crap, including his future third wife. And more than 20 bone fragments were removed. Still haven't invented ether yet, and they picked 23 bone fragments out of his ankle, and he's taken anesthesia. Known, he was celebrated as a hero. He learned that the spectacular victory at San Jacinto was a national cause celeb, and he gets a nickname, Old Sam Jacinto. Well, he returned to Texas when he healed up a little bit, and he re-entered Texas at St. Augustine. He had a friend who had a plantation home on that side of St. Augustine, and even on crutches, he's a larger-than-life hero to most Texans. He's already been elected first president of the Texas Republic, and he wasn't even here. The one thing is, there were political parties, two parties like there are now, Democrat and Republican. But in those days, the only parties were Houston and anti-Houston that were St. Joseph. Houston overwhelmingly was elected first president. He announced that when Stephen F. Austin, the first Secretary of State, died, he said the father of Texas is no more, and he magnanimously awarded Austin a permanent and a deserved title. Texas had no money. President Houston sometimes pledged his own credit, except he didn't have any money either. Calling on his great experience in government positions, Houston artfully managed to keep the Texas Republic functioning. Constitution did not permit a president to serve consecutive terms, so Houston continued his career in Congress. That's when he met his future wife, and he resoundingly won re-election as president the next time he was eligible. He provided strong direction to Texas. The Texas Republic was millions and millions of dollars in debt by then, and among Houston's economies was eliminating government offices and reducing government salaries, including his own. He employed consummate leadership during that period in breaking up the murderous regulator-moderator war that happened here in East Texas, Harrison County, Shelby County, and Panola District. 200 mounted regulators fought 100 moderators. But Houston got that thing broken up. There were 31 men who were killed in that. But he called on militia. 600 of them showed up, and he broke that thing up. Meanwhile, Houston took a third wife. In 1840, Houston, who was now 47, he married 21-year-old Margaret Lee, a Southern belle from Alabama. She had a fine education. She was deeply religious. Her father, now deceased, was a Baptist preacher. Her mother, Nancy, was also a devout Baptist, and she moved to Texas to be around her daughter. In 23 years of marriage, she bore him 8 children. There were 4 boys and 4 girls, and they were born within a 17-year period. So for 17 years, she was either pregnant or nursing or something, Anyway, finally, in 1854, for the children's sake, she persuaded him to be baptized at a creek near Independence where they were living. And Independence is where Baylor was at the time, and the head of Baylor was Reverend Rufus Burleson. Everybody came to see the great Sam Houston baptized. And so he baptized at the baptizing hole, put him down, and Reverend Burleson pulled him back up, and he said, "Now, Brother Sam, your sins are washed away." And he said, "Well, God help the fishes." Anyway, throughout his 2 presidential terms, Houston worked doggedly. And during the years following his second term, annexation negotiations were completed, thanks in great part to Houston's efforts. Texas became the 28th state in the Union. Houston and his friend Thomas Rusk were selected as U.S. senators. Without going into any detail at all, I'll just mention that he served 13 years in the U.S. Senate. and he was a staunch unionist. The one thing that happened is worth mentioning. Congressman Abraham Lincoln made a famous House divided speech based on Mark 3:25. And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And he's very famous for that, except Senator Houston made that same speech 8 years earlier, and he had this speech printed. There's proof. Then Senator Houston won election as governor in 1859. He's now held every high position that Texas has to offer. By the time Governor Houston took office, there was growing sentiment in Texas to secede from the Union. Adamantly opposed to secession, Houston War. Civil war will result, and that'll be followed by Southern defeat. And he was right. But a strong leadership faction in Texas maneuvered to achieve secession. Governor Houston struggled to thwart every move. The Texans were eager to join the Confederate States of America, and an ordinance of secession passed by a 3-1 margin. The night before he was expected to sign his oath of loyalty to the Confederacy, he already had an oath of loyalty to Texas, he was heard pacing in his stocking feet upstairs in his bedroom at the governor's mansion. One's still there. And he prayed all night in his upstairs bedroom. The next day, Houston refused to sign, and the office of governor was declared vacant. 2 days later, Houston and his family departed the governor's mansion for Huntsville. Once more, Houston had followed his conviction, and this time his stance ended his long career of leadership. His oldest son, Sam Houston Jr., was 19 when he was severely wounded at the Battle of Shiloh in 1862, but he did survive. And the next year, at the age of 70, Houston's health failed and he died in Huntsville. The house is still there that he died at. At the start of this program, I listed the impressive ways in which the public has memorialized and commemorated Sam Houston more than for most U.S. presidents. In fact, I got to thinking about this. If Texas were to carve out our own version of Mount Rushmore, let's say at Big Bend, a fabulous area there, or of course Paladera Canyon, the only canyon that is deeper in the United States is the Grand Canyon. If we were to do something like that, Sam Houston would have to be the first figure sculpted. I want to thank you for helping us to bring back the Panola College Lunchbox Special, and I want you to know that I am certainly grateful for your kind attention during my remarks. Thank you.
Phenomenal. I knew it would be. Yes, job. Let's give him another hand. Fourth grade, y'all were perfect. I'm so proud of y'all. Perfect, great listeners. Have you a treat. So I need you to stay where you are until everybody else leaves. Thank y'all so much for coming and making our Bring Back Lunchbox lecture such a great success. I would encourage you to stop by the library and go through the gallery and look at the Sam Houston exhibit that we have from Humanities Texas. Also, on the first floor, we have the Bill O'Neill book collection. Part of that collection, we have his 2 Sam Houston books. We also have his brand new Miles City book that is now in the collection. He will be coming back in December to do a book signing, tell us about his new book and do a book signing. I'll let you know the date of that a little closer to time. But we do have the exhibit, and we do have the Bill O'Neill book collection. So if you would like, we would love for you to see that. Thank you for coming.